recently who publishes, Matsura Ryoko has published 6 books since she started writing decades ago. Another writer I've been reading recently publishes an average of 6 books a year. And she is more representative than Matsura Ryoko. She's a Matsura Ryoko, right? Completely just incomparably unprolific. So trying to get a publisher, an American publisher, to publish an 800-page book by a writer who only has 6 books, and you're probably not really going to, there's no future. She's obviously not the next Murakami Haruki. Is just very difficult. Actually trying, and so one of the things I thought about, I read this book, I fell in love with it, I thought this is amazing, I definitely want to do this. And I happened to be friends with somebody who happened to get put on the committee responsible for choosing, just can't leave this room, or the internet.
Or the internet.
I happened to be friends with somebody who happened to get put on the selection committee for this Japanese governmental organization that funds translations. And we went out and had coffee the day before he went to participate in the committee and said, what would you like to translate? And I said, I would like to translate this book. And he went and he put it on the list, which is especially gratifying to me because this book, which is about a woman with a penis on her toe and has lots of, she travels around with a kind of sexual freak show. And then the author had previously, her first big hit was a book called Natural Woman, which attracted a lot of attention for its very explicit depictions of lesbian sex. The Japanese Literature Publishing Project is originally created with money raised by Ishihara Shintaro, or Shintaro Ishihara, the governor of Tokyo, who's famous as a misogynist and won't look women in the eye. Anyway, I was delighted to put this book on this list, funded by money that this guy had gathered. Then I translated the book, and I translated it pretty much the way I always had translated, which is to say I tried to be as, to get everything in, to be as literal as possible, whatever that means. Japanese, as you know, isn't written using letters, so there's really no such thing as a literal translation of Japanese. But I tried to be as accurate as possible, and to really stick to the rhythms of the prose. And the rhythms of the prose are very, very, it's a very verbose, very long kind of, sometimes stilted style that this writer has. And this is true of all of her books. And then I started working with the editor, and I in the beginning was thinking, this, you must keep it as it is. This is what how the book is put together, and it needs this voice. I thought it was very important. And to a certain extent, I still do think it's important that it has this stilted, long, verbose quality, because that, matched with a woman with a penis on her toe and this sexual freak show, that makes it really interesting, I thought. And I do think. But then when I started working with Elmer, the editor, he started pointing out that, especially in the beginning, is the reason I put both of these versions in. It's a kind of provocation, of course. The first section is the most heavily edited. This 800-page book doesn't become a 200-page book. It becomes slightly shorter. But it does change, and the differences are important, right? But ultimately, after talking with Elmer, I came to the conclusion that we would never find a publisher for this book if we left it as it was. And that changing certain elements, like the beginning, taking a 6-line beginning that could cause readers looking at the book in the store to say, "What?" and just close the book and put it back on the shelf, right? That's not going to get anyone anywhere. Whereas if we shave away a little bit of stuff, try and make it so that the reader will be hooked and drawn in, this book could deliver a big punch in the gut to these people.
What did the author say?
And the author she doesn't read English, so she doesn't. Did
you discuss the approach?
I talked with her a little bit, but that it's very funny also because the way this is all arranged is that JLPP hires an editor. So JLPP always, for all the books they publish, has an editor come in and edit things, and the authors sign on to that in advance, so they know that this will be happening. And some authors will say no. I mean, I don't know if authors say no because they don't want to have their books edited. It's probably more that no, they don't want to be associated with this governmental organization that's associated with the shadow of Shintaro or something. I mean, there are complex things going on there too. But I don't think that she doesn't seem to mind, from what I can tell.
Some authors are very pragmatic about that.
Yeah, I imagine.
Quite a few authors are right on board with that. It really depends a lot on the author. You're lucky she's alive. You can actually.
And you actually, I mean, you have all kinds of. I was thinking Murakami Haruki has had famously one of his books was Knopf had a book of his called The Wind Up Bird Chronicle published, and apparently in the contract said the book cannot be longer than 500 pages. And the book was longer than 500 pages, so it had to be cut. And J. Rubin, who was the translator, rather than have somebody else who would be, perhaps not all that sympathetic or really not in tune with Murakami, edit the book, decided that he would do it himself. So he translated the whole thing, and then spent a lot of time, unpaid of course, editing it down. Showed it to Murakami, talked about it with him. Murakami knows English. He's translated He's translated more books than he's written of his own, like his own fiction. He then took some of those changes and put them into the paperback version of the same book when it came out in Japanese.
In Japanese.
Right, and this kind of thing
that's not unheard of.
happens all the time. Yeah.
But there are also horror stories on the other side of authors who want to interfere with the translation, but they don't have sufficient knowledge of the translating language, broken contracts and likes. But these stories also.
But I kind of came to the conclusion after working through this that people talk about translation as politics, right, or the political side of translation, and I completely agree. But this book in particular made me realize that sometimes the notion that translation is politics or that translation is a political activity really is not. It's not a very abstract kind of matter. It's politics in the sense that we see politics going on all the time in television, right? You work some tax breaks into a certain deal that is being floated in the hope that you can get 20 people who didn't vote for it yesterday to vote for it today, right? You have to give something in order to get something. You have to give something in order to be able to give anything at all. And in this case, I decided, it's actually worth it to make small sacrifices in order to be able to get something much bigger in the long run. Which is to say, rather than have this translation be, people talk about translation as loss all the time, right? What's lost in translation? I think this is one of the most patently absurd notions out there. Translation does not involve any loss, right? You have somebody who couldn't have read a book and you give them a book. That's 100% gain. So in order to get 100% gain, you have to be willing sometimes to take what might seem to you to be a little bit of a loss, is how I understand it.
You can also justify it in another. I mean, you can also look at it another way. I mean, when you talk about translating, and when I teach translation, I always say, you've got to look at this book and say, what is the effect on the original reader? And how does the original reader perceive it? Not that it's ever going to be identical between two cultures. I mean, the foreign reader's never going to read it. Even if they read it in the original language, it's not going to be the same. But in this case, if a Japanese reader comes to this book and is not put off by that beginning, that's a different experience than the English reader. And translation is all about judgment calls. You walk very fine lines in which side you go. But if you're going to, for example, if that had been funny in Japanese to have it be long like that, well, it wasn't funny in English. It would have to be funny, and you may have to do more. You may have to transform it more. You've got to somehow, the line is between a language lesson. Are you teaching them Japanese, or are you translating a work of literature? And so you've got to look back, I think, and you have to